topic. So the key concepts that you need to know for memory are firstly about information processing. So the idea that our memory processes information like a computer does. So for example, we have input which comes in via our senses in the same way that a computer has input devices like a keyboard or a mouse, or as shown here on this image. We also encode information. So in the same way that a computer encodes information in zeros and ones, we encode information, so they sense information into a simpler form to store. So that simpler form to store is the definition. They like to ask questions about that, so it's good to know that. So for example, the nerve impulses in your ear are changed into auditory cortex, which is where sound is processed in your brain. Storage is another information processing key concept. This is where memory is filed away to be accessed and retrieved later when required. And actually, what's good to add on to that is that it's like the creation of memories into long-term memory. I was getting confused with another one then, which is retrieval. Retrieval is when memory is located and brought back into working memory. So, for example, the information is fetched from long-term memory into short-term memory so that you can do something with it, which is usually output. So you usually talk or draw or write in the same way that a computer has output devices, and you can find out the information on a computer if it prints it out or through sound or through the monitor. Some more key concepts in memory are forgetting. So we've got anterograde amnesia. So this is when you can't make any new memories. So for example, like Clive Waring couldn't make any new memories. So nothing passes from short term to long term. There's like a problem with the way that that passes through. And this is because of damage to the hippocampus. So the area of the brain that's responsible for creating new memories is damaged. Therefore, you have anterograde amnesia. We also need to know retrograde amnesia. So this is when you forget memories from the past. So you have some damage to your long-term memory. Again, Clive Waring had retrograde amnesia because he forgot certain things like what a scarecrow was for and, you know, who Prince Philip was. And this is caused by damage to the frontal lobe. So all our memories of ourselves are usually in that frontal lobe, right at the front of the brain. And then we've also got procedural memory. And this is like things like motor skills, like how to ride a bike, how to make a cup of tea, how to play a piano, Clive Waring's case, how to play a sport. So anything that's got steps to it that is a skill, like how to tie a shoelace, all things like that. It's procedural memory, and it's your cerebellum that allows you to do that. So if you've got any damage to your cerebellum, which is the cauliflower structure at the back of your brain, then you'll not be able to remember procedural tasks. We also need to know the types of forgetting that occur in the different stores. So, for example, decay happens in the sensory store. So this is where input goes into the store. It'll make a bit more sense when we do the first theory, which is the multi-store model. So I'll show you that in a minute. But when you don't pay attention to information, rather than passing into short-term memory when you do pay attention, it just fades away, and that's called decay. So if you've not rehearsed it and said it again and again and again, it won't pass into into long-term memory. And it'll just fade away from that short-term memory store. In fact, actually, hold on. It's when you don't rehearse it, I'm sorry. Oh, so decay happens both in the sensory store and the short-term memory store. That's why I was getting confused. And then displacement also happens in short-term memory. So because short-term memory's got a limited capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 items, so 5 to 9 items, when information is going in, the older information gets pushed out as newer information comes in. So it gets pushed out, which is what displacement means. So you forget it for that reason. And then in long-term memory, the belief is that everything's in there that you've obviously paid attention to and rehearsed, but you need a cue to be able to access it. So if you've forgotten anything, it's because you've not got that cue. And the cue is something that was present at encoding. So when you made the memory, it also has to be present at retrieval. So for example, if you were in a classroom and it had loads of displays on the wall, and you learnt the information in that classroom, then when you do an assessment in that classroom, you've got the cues, which will help you remember. But if you do it in a different place, like the exam hall, you might forget because you don't have those same cues. And so if those cues are present, more likely to remember it. So the first theory in memory is the multi-store model. So this is kind of a little bit about what we've already spoken about. So we've got the sensory store. This is information that's inputted from the environment. If you pay attention, then it goes into short-term memory. If you don't, then it decays and it's forgotten. And you need to know the duration, capacity, and coding of all these stores. So it's approximately 2 seconds in the sensory store. And it says approximately because each sense, so your 5 senses, have different durations, which you don't need to know at GCSE. So we say approximately 2 seconds. Capacity is very, very large. So the Sperling study showed that lots of information goes in there. It's just that we only pay attention to a little bit of it. And that's why we forget most of it, because it fades away and decays. And then it's encoded in those separate senses. Short-term memory. Capacity for this one is 7 plus or minus 2 items, as mentioned before, so 5 to 9 items. If the capacity is full, then the incoming information displaces the older information, pushes it out. It lasts about 30 seconds. Some things say like 15 to 30 seconds, but if you say approximately or up to 30 seconds should be fine. And so that allows us to be able to have a conversation, because obviously we need to process stuff that we're hearing to be able to talk and things like that. So that explains why it's a little bit longer. And if you don't rehearse it, so maintenance rehearsal is saying it over and over again, then it will decay if it's not already been displaced. And if you do rehearse it, it'll go into long-term memory. And so the way that it's encoded is auditory, because you're saying it out loud or in your head. And also the strategy of chunking helps to increase the capacity of short-term memory to more items. So for example, if you have a string of letters, say you have KFC, OCR, AQA, you can do that in 3 chunks, but that's still 9 items. So you can do basically 5 to 9 chunks rather than 5 to 9 items. So you can have a much bigger capacity if you use chunking. And then we've got long-term memory. Capacity and duration are unlimited. There's never been a point where we've reached capacity, or, lots of people can remember memories from when they were really, really small. So clearly, it's unlimited. And then the encoding for long-term memory is semantically. So in meaning, sometimes called elaborative rehearsal. So this is where it like means something to you. Think of like Willingham in the development topic, quite similar. And that's how we kind of remember things within the long-term memory. And then obviously on the model, it shows as well that we can retrieve the information from long-term memory into short-term memory so that we can output it, which kind of finishes off the whole model. And then the criticisms of this multi-store model, it is very simple. It suggests that the long-term memory is a single store, whereas actually we've got evidence from Clive Waring where different parts of the brain store long-term memories. So for example, the hippocampus is for kind of memories about ourselves, whereas the cerebellum is for procedural memory. And so therefore, in actual fact, you might want to just, rather than hippocampus is a little bit iffy, you might put something like the frontal lobe has got I think it's the frontal lobe autobiographical memories, or episodic memories. And then the cerebellum is procedural memory. And then that means that because we've clearly got more than one type of long-term memory, it's not a single store. So that means the multi-store model can't be valid. And also the model places loads of emphasis on rehearsal rather than meaning, to pass into long-term memory. Although we did say it was encoded semantically, so it's a little bit iffy, that one. But anyway, the point is that if anything shocking happens, we remember that straight away. We don't have to say it over and over and over again for it to go into long-term memory. So maybe it's not a valid way of actually explaining how memory is formed. Like, it's clearly formed in multiple different ways. And actually, it might be that there's more of that meaning going on rather than the kind of rehearsal that the multi-store model like puts more emphasis on. And then the study that looks into this and supports the multi-store model is Wilson et al., which is about Clive Waring and having amnesia. So he had both anterograde and retrograde. He was born in 1938 in the UK, gifted musician, so very good at playing the piano. And they followed Clive for 21 years in this longitudinal case study. So obviously it's an in-depth study on Clive. So they did lots of different things to study his memory. So they did neuropsychological tests like IQ test, verbal fluency, digit span to test his capacity of his short-term memory. And when MRI scans became more available, they also scanned his brain, which is why we know that certain areas like the hippocampus and the frontal lobe were damaged. So in 1985, he was first diagnosed with kind of like a little bit like the cold sore virus, and this destroyed part of his brain. And he was having lots of memory issues. He couldn't remember a lot of memory, but his memory span was kind of normal. So his immediate like memory, so that 30 seconds of duration was fine, but he couldn't remember things in the past. So he was showing lots of retrograde amnesia. Um, he was unable to recall any details of his life before his illness, and he couldn't create new memories, so he's showing that anterograde amnesia. So whilst the duration of his memory was fine, he couldn't actually transfer it from short-term memory into long-term memory. So maybe there was something damaged in that rehearsal, or if it's not rehearsal, because we've mentioned the model might not be very good, maybe there was something else going on there. Now, his verbal performance was fine, so he was very good verbally, and his IQ was average. However, he was quite gifted before, so his IQ had actually declined, perhaps because of his memory issues. So maybe memory is implicated in IQ. Um, and there's an example of his semantic memory not being very good. So, for example, he thought a scarecrow was a bird that flies and makes funny noise, so he couldn't remember what objects were, and he kind of just made them up. And he has abnormalities, so problems in his hippocampus and his frontal lobe, which was showing the anterograde amnesia of the hippocampus, retrograde amnesia in the frontal lobe, and he didn't know like who Prince Philip was. So again, another example of semantic memory issues. And he didn't think there was anything wrong with his memory either. So he was very confused by the whole kind of situation. And so the suggestion is that memory clearly has separate stores, has a short-term memory, has long-term memory. Also that long-term memory has separate stores. So multi-store model is probably not that good. So we can use Clive Waring as evidence for the criticism of the multi-store model. And some strengths of Clive Waring's study is that it's longitudinal, we can follow over time, you can get lots of qualitative data and quantitative data, so the scores from the IQ test and the digit span and things like that, and really find out a valid way of how memory works. However, we have only got Clive, and so maybe he's not representative of how everybody's memories work. And as well, his memory's damaged, so maybe if his memory wasn't damaged, it would work differently. So we don't know that. So we've got a lack of population validity, not representative of everybody. Got cultural biases in the UK, so there's lots of issues with the sample. And also, it's very unethical. Like Clive was very distressed whilst he was being studied. So, for example, they got him to play the piano, and when he stopped, he like had a seizure and was very confused about what was happening, or he was quite distressed that he thought the doctors weren't helping him and things like that. So you could argue that again, he can't give his informed consent. He doesn't really know what he's consenting to because his memory, he doesn't create any new memories. So every time he sees the researchers, he thinks they're new people. So he wouldn't be able to consent to take part in it. So probably unethical for that reason. Now, theory two is about reconstructive memory. So, this is the idea that our memory is not like a video recording of what happens, but it's based on our kind of prior experiences. So, we create schemas of what we expect to happen. So, for example, if we see someone standing at a bus stop, our schema is that they're waiting for a bus, but actually they could just be waiting to cross the road, or it could be raining. So, schemas help us to kind of make shortcuts in our thinking so that we don't have to process everything, but they can be affected by leading questions, which is kind of what this theory talks a little bit more about. So there was an example of this from Bartlett's War of the Ghosts, which found it was a story. When they told UK participants this story, and they had to kind of like pass it on, like when you whisper it to somebody else and the last person reads it out. What they found was that your culture actually has an impact on what you remember. So in the story, it was talking about hunting for seals, but a lot of UK participants had changed it to hunting for fish because they were in boats. So the schema was, well, if someone's in a boat and they're hunting for a fish because we don't really hunt for seals in the UK. So our culture can have an impact on these schemas as well. So these expectations allow us to make quick judgments. Now, another thing that might happen is that because these schemas fill in the gaps, we might make things up and we might lie without realizing that we're doing that, and that's called confabulation. They like to ask questions about confabulation, so it's worth knowing that. And then when were asked a question that's quite leading. So, for example, in the Loftus and Palmer study that we learned about, where they showed some car crash clips, which is why these pictures are here, participants were asked about how fast were the cars going when they hit each other and when they smashed each other. They found that because of the way that that question was worded, they were more likely to estimate a higher speed estimate, so 32 miles per hour here, rather than hit was 14 and contacted was 12. Oh, sorry, no, this actually is the results of reporting seeing broken glass. It was slightly different for the speed estimates. It was in the 30s, I think, for smash, and it was a little bit less for hit. Probably quite similar to these, actually. It's why I got confused. But the point is that because you've got a schema in your mind for cars smashing into each other and cars hitting or contacting just is a little bit like a contact, and so therefore you might then confabulate and then say a higher speed estimate because actually they were going the same speed because they used an independent measure design and different participants had different verbs. And then they asked the second question, which is the second one: did you see any broken glass? So the ones that had the verb smashed, more of them reported seeing broken glass than hit and contacted. And again, the schema is if something smashes, like the cars smash into each other, you think of smash, what smashes, glass smashes, and then you might confabulate and think that there's broken glass when actually there wasn't any broken glass. Now, some criticisms of this theory is that it's very reductionist. It focuses on schemas of the reason, like we reconstruct memories and confabulate, but it doesn't actually tell us how that happens. So it's very simplistic and therefore might not be very valid. It's also difficult to test. Like we know a schema exists according to this theory, but when we put people in a brain imaging scanner, we can't see them and we don't exactly know how they work and how they're processed. So again, might not be very valid for that reason. Now, the piece of research that goes with this one is Braun et al. On the impact of autobiographical advertisement. And this is trying to see whether or not this autobiographical advertising would have an impact on how people remember their childhood experiences. And they want to know if they would imagine shaking hands with Mickey Mouse even though they didn't. And this is called advertising inflation. So inflation means kind of like you it's increasing if you think of it like that. So you're imagining something that didn't happen. So it's kind of been inflated by the fact that you've watched this advert, but actually it wasn't that before. And this is because it says inflation because the rating on a rating scale of how much they remembered shaking hands with the Mickey Mouse, and so therefore it will inflate because it will get higher on the rating scale. So the sample's 107 university students, and we've got males and females, and they're from the USA. And yeah, we've got culture bias. They've received course credit, which is a bit of an ethical issue because this means that instead of writing an essay, you get credit for your course. So people might be more likely to do it because of that, and therefore there might be some ethical issues with the right to withdraw. And we've got a lab experiment, very controlled experiment, everything's standardized, so quite reliable. And the IV that's being manipulated in the first experiment is whether or not they've got this autobiographical Disney advert or whether they've got like a factual advert. Now, the Disney advert is read, so they read the advert to themselves, and it's kind of like worded in a way like, oh, imagine that you're at Disneyland and you kind of like putting yourself in the position of actually being there. And then right at the end of the advert, because in fact, in the beginning of it, it talks about like what it smells like and what it looks like. And so you're really kind of getting into like imagining that you're there. And then at the end, it advertises like you can come to Disneyland and things like that. And then obviously the factual advert's got, nothing to do with autobiographical, it's just facts about Disney. In fact, no, it's not facts about Disney. It's just a factual kind of advert that's not Disney. And then we've got um, a life events questionnaire. So loads of life events on there, but the only question that they're really interested in is, did you remember shaking hands with Mickey Mouse at Disneyland? Um, and they've got in independent measure design, they only either see the Disney advert or the non-Disney advert. So you actually want to say non-Disney advert if you're answering an exam question. So it was the fourth question on the life events questionnaire, and they had to rate it on the rating scale of 1 to 100. Definitely did not happen, definitely did happen. They also were rating whether or not they thought that the advert was favourable or unfavourable, so did they like it or not. Whether or not the ad used empathy, because in the autobiographical one there is empathy there, whereas in the control one, the factual one, there isn't any empathy there. So again, it's a little bit of a control that to see, did the participants actually empathise in the first one? Did they put themselves in that situation? Because if they didn't, then the autobiographical advert wouldn't work. And then we've got 2 distraction tasks because they're doing quite a few things so that they don't kind of twig what it's about and show demand characteristics. And they've got a questionnaire about personal memories of Disney, so whether they've been before and things like that. So in week 1, they're randomly assigned the advert and they complete the life events questionnaire along with all the other tasks that we've mentioned. They go away for a week, they come back, and then they read the advert. So they've not seen the advert the first time, they've just completed the life events questionnaire. So they've been randomly assigned, but they've not actually done anything yet, they've just done the life events. Week 2, they read the advert. And obviously in the autobiographical one, they're asked to visualise themselves in the advert. They've got 5 minutes to write down what the advert made them feel, rating their attitude and empathy, so all the kind of scales that we mentioned. They've got the 5-minute distraction task. And then the experimenter from week 1 comes in very panicked, says that there's been a problem, they've kind of like lost their other questionnaire. Can they do the life events questionnaire again so it doesn't ruin the experiment? So they do that. Then they have a 15-minute distractor test again, and then they describe their memory of visiting Disney. And again, they're rating that on how perfectly they'd remembered that. And they also, at the end, to just see if there were any demand characteristics, asked them what they thought the aim was. So the results found that 65% of those with the autobiographical advert mentioned memories of Disney World. 74% caused them to imagine the experience, and 63% mentioned they would visit Disney in the future. So what this means then is that there was imagination inflation. So we've got, oh, sorry, those bits there are just showing the impact of the autobiographical advert. So it did make them remember, because remember, this is all about memory. It made them remember Disney. They talked about Disney. They had a positive experience of Disney, which is what the advert was trying to do. So the autobiographical effects are working. And then the next bit is about imagination inflation. So did it actually get them to remember something that they didn't remember before, or remember it more strongly than before? So we've got significantly more participants who watched the Disney advert showed an increased score on that question about Mickey Mouse. So 90% versus 47%. So this is the Disney advert. This is the factual advert, non-Disney advert. So we're showing there that autobiographical advertising inflates our memories. We confabulate, we remember stuff that didn't really happen. And then we've got more participants in the Disney group showed positive thoughts about Disney than control. So again, showing the impact of the autobiographical effects is quite positive. You remember it more likely. And nobody guessed the aim, so there's no demand characteristics there. Now, after this, Braun was like, okay, so we've got people remembering things that didn't happen, but would this still happen if it was an obviously wrong thing that we were trying to get them to remember? So like distorting their memory, changing their memory with something that was obviously wrong. Like, you know, in the Ash study in the social influence topic, when it was obviously wrong, they're kind of doing that. So they're putting false information this time into the advert. So this time we've got 167 psychology students from an American university. Still a lab experiment. And this time the false information is Bugs Bunny, because Bugs Bunny is a Warner Bros. Character, so would not be at Disneyland. Ariel is a Disney character, but only came out in 1999, so it was too far after these students would have been. What I mean by that, so that wasn't explained very well, is that they were too old to have seen Ariel when they were younger. So obviously another example of false information. And then they've got a factual advert about Disney. And then again, they're doing the same thing with the life events questionnaire, but this time, rather than saying Mickey Mouse, they've got to put cartoon character, because obviously they're not asking about Mickey Mouse this time. And we've still got independent measure design. They're only reading one of the adverts, so either about Bugs Bunny, Ariel, or a factual one. And the results for this one found that the autobiographical ads were rated as more involving, so more kind of empathetic, more kind of like thinking about yourself there. We've got Bugs Bunny was 5.1, Ariel 4.8 compared to the factual of 3.8, so they go all together. And then we've got all of them increase in confidence of shaking hands at week 2, but more for the autobiographical. So 76% for Ariel, 78% for Bugs Bunny, and 62% for factual. So again, they're remembering something that was clearly false. Like that couldn't be a real memory. Because if you think about the first study, we have nothing to check whether these memories are true or not, whether they're real or not, because we don't know whether they've been there or not. Well, it's a self-report, they could be lying. But we know on this second experiment that they can't have remembered Ariel and they can't have remembered Bugs Bunny because they weren't there when they were children. So we've got a better idea of the impact of the distortion on memory. So the conclusion is that autobiographical advertisement is really effective at getting you to remember information about what you want to sell. So Disney, it has a positive impact, so you're more likely to think positively of the thing that's being advertised. So really good for companies to use autobiographical advertisement. But the problem with it, the disadvantage and why this study might be unethical, is that it does have an impact on your memory because you will start to remember things that didn't actually happen to you. So that's a bit of an issue. But it does support the theory that memories are reconstructed from our schemas, because obviously we're confabulating and not realizing that we're making stuff up. So some strengths of the study, very standardised, easy to replicate and repeat again, so more reliable results about the impact of autobiographical advertising on memory. There's no gender bias because we've got both males and females, so representative, you might want to add that to that. Very culturally biased because it's in the USA, very age biased because the students probably not going to be able to generalise to everybody, so it's unrepresentative and their findings can't be generalised because actually other people's memories might be different. Students' memories are actually quite good because they're always trying to remember material, like they're revising for exams and things like that, so it might be different. And also the USA is particularly impacted by Disney, whereas other places might not be impacted as much, so they might not remember as much about Disney or have a positive impact, a positive opinion of Disney after the impact of the advert. And then because it's in a lab, lacks ecological validity, so the findings don't actually tell you about memory in the real world. It's self-reported as well, so it's not a real advert that you would see because you're reading it. Although obviously, if you read it in a newspaper, maybe it would be different if it was a TV advert, for example. And very unethical because you're actually changing people's memories without them realizing that that's what's happening. And then finally, the application to real world. So how can all this information be used in the real world? Well, it could be used in advertising. So in adverts, you probably want to put some cues in to make them memorable. So for example, Gillette has got the best a man can get. That's the slogan. L'Oreal, because I'm worth it. We've got HSB, the world's local bank. Tesco, every little helps. So we've got kind of like cues to help us. I'm just thinking actually that one is more repetition because we've got the familiarity with the brand. So like you're saying it over and over again, which is why they go compare there as well. So because it's repeated so many times, it's rehearsing it for you, so it goes into your long-term memory. Whereas the cue one, actually, the cue one might be more like if, for example, you are sad. Like you see the advert is somebody who's sad and they give the product and then it makes them feel better, then the next time you feel sad you'll want that product. So they do this with like I think it's like Baxter's soup, and they say like, oh, a hug in a mug. So when you don't feel very good and you feel ill, for example, you might have some soup and then it's like a hug. You feel good about it and it makes you feel happier, so you're more likely to then buy the soup in the future. So sometimes they do cues like that are emotional cues, or it could be context cues as well. And they also try to make sure that they don't overload because we've got a limited capacity in short-term memory and we don't want information displacing, like pushing out those old things. So the slogans are really short. So as you can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they're only about 5 items, their slogans, and that's because they don't want to overload and exceed the capacity of short-term memory. And finally, we've got autobiographical advertising for the adverts because we've got another application as well. So, for example, as we've seen in the Braun study, we can activate someone's personal memory, and that then creates a feeling of like nostalgia, and you feel really good and positive about that product. So the Christmas advert for Coca-Cola makes everyone remember like Christmas because it always comes on the TV. And so you think positive feelings because you're happy it's Christmas, then you're happy to have a Coca-Cola. So it creates those positive feelings, and you're more likely to buy the product because it makes you feel good. So they usually kind of like show products that are like memories that you might have. Like there might be a barbecue with your family, and then every time you have a barbecue, you remember that, and then you're more likely to buy the product. So it kind of attaches it onto a personal memory, and it's this idea of feeling nostalgic, so wanting to have that memory again and relive that experience again. Now, another application of the memory topic is neuropsychology. So, this is neurological kind of like testing because we can use memory tests to see what our memory is like they did in Clive Waring's study. So, you can use the Wechsler memory scale, which will see whether or not you've got any brain damage after brain injury, like with Clive Waring. And this will identify things like your digit span, your verbal fluency, your auditory memory, immediate and delayed memory recall. So it tests lots and lots of things, but can only be used for 16 to 90-year-olds. So can't be used for children. So the Wechsler memory scale will give you an idea of whether or not memory has declined. And then what that means is you can then help those people by rehabilitating them and things like that. So with Clive Waring, they might help to develop his memory, but obviously he's got brain damage, so it's a little bit difficult to do. But say, for example, you had a stroke, um, the brain might still have a little bit of plasticity, so you could maybe rehabilitate somebody after that, but you'd use the Wechsler to see like what the problems were and then what you would need to rehabilitate them on. So I've made a bucket on memory as well, so you can go and play that if you want to test your knowledge. So hopefully that was helpful. Questions on Teams so that you can have a go at some of those and have a look at some mark schemes and things. So any questions, as always, let me know.